Hello, everyone. My name is Li. I'm the chair of the Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development. On behalf of the International Colloquium Planning Team and the CGDSD Directory Board, I would like to welcome you all to the second session of the 2025 International Colloquium. This year, we are proud to present a series of 4 webinars as part of the colloquium. The colloquium will explore critical issues in higher education internationalization, focusing on international students' education, well-being, and social justice in global contexts. The missions will address things such as mentoring international professionals, transnational pedagogy, graduate student support, career pathways, transitions, social justice, immigration, and redefining international students. Before we get started, I would like to share that here at ACPA, we are invested in the idea of equity and inclusion. I would like to share our statement here. Please take some time to read and understand ACPA's commitment to equity and inclusion here. We are also excited to share that our commission is actively recruiting new directory board members. Involvement in the directory board will provide opportunity for ongoing engagement with colleagues with a shared interest in international education and cross-cultural learning. We have up to 10 open positions. The application deadline is 11:59 p.m. Central Time on April the 30th this month, at the end of this month. The application and information session related to the whole process can be found on our link tree. And please feel free to introduce and get connected with our audience and presenters today. Today's presentation, the title is Professional Learning Communities to Advance International Wellbeing and Success, presented by Dr. Waltz and Sayyora. And now I would like to quickly introduce the abstract for the presentation today. This presentation explores how professional learning communities, PLCs, can address persistent equity gaps and challenges faced by international students in the U.S. higher education. Despite rising enrollment, international students continue to experience social, cultural, and academic barriers, particularly language difficulties. Ruling in the equity scorecard traditions, PLCs engage faculty, staff, and administrators in inquiry and actions to foster intercultural competencies and create inclusive campuses. Participants will examine international students' experiences, understand equity-minded PLCs, and analyze opportunities to institutional implementation. Through interactive discussions, this session equips higher education professionals with tools to support international student well-being and success effectively. And now it's my honor to also introduce the presenter, number 1, Dr. Waltz. Dr. Waltz is an assistant professor in the School of Counseling, Higher Education, Leadership, and Foundations at Bowling Green State University. An elective scholar of organizational learning and change, her research explores a wide range of internal and external pressures that incentivize equity-minded practices within public colleges and universities. Recent work has focused on graduate student laboring organizing, private philanthropic foundations, and play-centered teaching strategies that critically disrupt compliance orientations in higher education and student affairs graduate programs. Prior to taking up a faculty role, she worked for over a decade in a range of student academic affairs positions across the US and abroad. And the second presenter is Sayyora. She's a doctoral candidate in leadership studies in Bowling Green State University. Her research focuses on self-regulated learning, particularly intervention that enhance academic goal attainment. She has intensive experience in ESL instruction and educational leadership, with a strong interest in intercultural competence and international student success. Sayyora has presented at various conferences and active contributes to research on equity in higher education. She's passionate about fostering inclusive learning environments and developing professional learning communities to support diverse student populations. Now, let's invite our presenters to share their screen and start their presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to be part of the community here today. We're really excited to share some of this work and to hopefully engage mostly in some robust conversation about what does it look like to build professional learning communities, to take institutional responsibility for equity-mindedness towards international student experiences on our campuses. And as Sayyora is getting the slide deck set up, I do just want to take a quick moment to note kind of the moral imperative of the moment. I feel like every morning I log on and doom scroll my social media, and there are stories again and again about what's happening to international student and scholar visas. And so as we're talking about equity-mindedness, which is an imperative of institutional responsibility, I think for all of us, whether we're domestic or international, whether we are students or faculty or staff, to be thinking about what is our responsibility and how do we build coalitions to say that if students are being admitted into our programs, how are we keeping each other safe? How are we keeping each other here? All of those questions are feeling more important and more pressing than ever. And so that's part of what's motivating this conversation today. But to go back, my name is Allie Watts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here with my wonderful, incredible doctoral assistant to give a bit of a conversation and some dialogue about professional learning communities that advance international student well-being and success. And I'll start off, we are at Bowling Green State University, which is in north central Ohio, and I want to read our land acknowledgement. So the region in which Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated inhabit the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Odawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations present and past who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history and thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. We move to the agenda real quick. Awesome. Great. So real briefly, obviously, you're going to get all of this in just a second, but just to give you a roadmap of where we're headed, we'll talk a little bit about what entered us into this work, what motivates us, why are we curious about doing international equity work in this particular way. Sayyora is going to share some background, which I know many of you in this room will likely be familiar with, but just to ground us in some common literature, some common data, talking about internationalization and barriers that students experience in their pursuit of belonging on campus. I'm then going to talk about some of my prior work around the concept of equity-mindedness and the equity scorecard approach, which comes out of the University of Southern California's Center for Urban Education. And then we're going to talk about our proposal for what it might look like to have international student-focused professional learning communities using the equity scorecard approach, which is about a bit of a novel intervention in the equity scorecard strategy. We're going to do some activities. So those of you who thought you were going to be here passively to listen to a lecture is not what's going to happen. We're going to engage at that point. And then draw some themes and talk about next steps that are coming both on Bowling Green's campuses and hopefully as part of a networked national effort here as well, and then engage in some open discussion. Sayyora, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Sayyora Ibadullaeva. Right now, I'm completing my PhD in leadership studies at Bowling Green State University, and I focus my research on self-regulated learning as well as international students' experiences in U.S. higher education And as an international student myself, this topic isn't just academic for me, it's also really personal. And I'm really excited to share our work with you today alongside with my wonderful supervisor, Dr. Watts.
As I said, I'm Allie Watts. I'm going to talk a little bit later, but what brings me into this work is partially my background as what's called a third culture kid. I grew up in a highly migrant household. I lived in 9 states and 5 countries by the time I graduated high school. And so while I have never been an international student in the US, I have been an international student abroad. And Hannah says also a third culture kid. Shout out to the TCKs of the world. But it was often a matter of trying to figure out who I was time and time again as we moved across, whether it was state contexts or national contexts, thinking about how my identity was often attached to different forms of boundary crossing and border crossing, which pulled me eventually, while I was in my doctoral program at Penn State, into a thing called the Equity Pedagogy Network, which builds on the equity scorecard model. And what does it look like to hold institutional responsibility for student sense of belonging? And what can we be doing actively, having agency as faculty, as practitioners, as emerging leaders in our field, to take accountability for that sense of belonging? So we'll talk more about that in just a bit.
To get us started and begin thinking more intentionally, we have a short entry ticket activity. It's a chance to reflect on your own assumptions or prior knowledge about international students and equity-minded practices. Dr. Watts, we are sharing link. Yep. We're sharing link in the chat box. Please go ahead and click on it now. And it will take you to two questions. First, we will spend 30 seconds for the first one, and then we'll move on to the second one. Wonderful. What can we move on to the next one?
It's saying that the presenter has to change slides. Are you ready for the next? To move to question 2?
Yep.
Perfect.
This is question 2.
May have given away question 2 a little bit of the introductions. Oops.
It's wonderful. So many people were listening. I think we're good to move, right? Thank you, everyone. Participation. All right. Now we'll start with the background. It's about international student enrollment, growth, and impact. Over the past few decades, we have seen a dramatic expansion in the internationalization of US higher education. Back in 1980s, there were about 305,000 international students studying in the US. That number has since more than tripled. So according to the Institute of International Education's Open Door report from 2023, US institutions hosted over 1.05 million international students during the 2022-2023 academic year. That's a 12% increase from the previous year. It's the largest single-year growth in over 4 decades. These students come from more than 210 countries, with the largest number arriving from India and China, followed by nations in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. This continued growth highlights the strong global demand for US higher education. This growth brings significant benefits to US institutions. International students contribute to campus diversity, global learning, and innovation. In STEM fields, they are a major force behind graduate research. According to NAFSA, their presence generated over $40 billion in economic contributions in 2022-23. And this money supported more than 368,000 jobs. Beyond the economic impact, their presence enhances cultural exchange, helps build global networks, and improves the intercultural competence of domestic students, which are the key goals of higher education in a globalized world. But despite the many contributions international students make, they often encounter serious barriers once they arrive on campus. These challenges are not only personal, they are also deeply systemic. Research consistently points to ongoing issues, such as language barriers, difficulty adjusting to new academic systems, and feeling of cultural isolation are still very common. What's more troubling is that international students are often left out of institutional equity conversations altogether. They are frequently racialized, stereotyped, or viewed through a deficit lens. And their experiences aren't shaped by just one factor, but by intersecting identities such as race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation, which can compound the challenges they face. A 2023 study by Ibadullaeva and colleagues reviews 20 years of literature and found something very alarming. There has been little to no real progress in addressing these long-standing issues. That means institutions are still relying on outdated or incomplete support structures that simply aren't working. And we can't ignore the impact of the broader socio-political climate. Many international students face visa-related stress, xenophobia, and microaggressions. These aren't isolated incidents. They are systemic patterns that demand a systemic response.
Yeah. So the conversations that Sayyora and I started having this past fall were coming out of, she started with a literature review that really talked about a lot of these challenges, these patterns that she was continuing to see. And we were struggling with the concept of what is our institutional responsibility? And so for me, I went back to my prior training on racial equity mindedness. And so this is a concept or a cognitive schema that Estela Mara Ben-Simon, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Southern California, and the generations at this point of scholars and practitioners that she's trained. I came up under Dr. Alicia Dowd, who's at Penn State, who's also been very active in this movement, along with folks like Ramon Liera, Tia Brown McNair, and many others who are trying to promote this concept that racial equity and equity-mindedness is a challenge to this deficit-minded idea, that it's on the students to assimilate. It is on the students to bridge the gaps or to address the barriers in their belonging and their experience that they keep reporting. They keep telling us that there is a problem in terms of the way that they are experiencing the US higher education environment that they've chosen to enter into. So the schema that's promoted in equity-mindedness is an insistence that administrators, faculty, and staff need to develop in order to address, originally in Dr. Ben-Simon's approach, racial inequity on their campuses. This literature is deeply, deeply bedded in trying to address white supremacy and challenges that Black, Hispanic, Latinx students experience on their college campuses. But we're promoting an effort to expand that or to think a little bit differently about it as well. So equity-mindedness refers to individuals having the knowledge to be conscious of race in this context, being aware that racialized patterns are embedded in university policies, practices, and norms, and then using data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sometimes gender, and sexuality in order to identify racial equity gaps in their practice, and then taking responsibility for changing policies, practices, and norms that sustain racial inequity. So this is the mindset approach of what does it mean to be equity-minded in our work. And then Estella loves to say that there are three components to doing equity work. There's the equity work in your head, in your heart, and in your hands, right? That you need to build the cognitive toolkits, you need to build the empathy, and then you need to put the gosh darn things to work. And so what does it mean to do equity work with your hands? And this is what brings us eventually to the concept of professional learning communities. We can move to the next slide, would be great. Okay, so professional learning communities, or PLCs, are networked opportunity structures that are built for institutional stakeholders to come together to share knowledge, to brainstorm problem solving, to work really deeply and really critically with their data. Again, disaggregating. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of applying the equity scorecard approach to international students, and some of that has to do with bad data, flawed data, difficulties in disaggregating data across that population. But I do want to say that we run into some of those problems when working with domestic racialized students as well, in the sense that if you were going to look at disaggregated race data by race or ethnicity, oftentimes equity scorecard processes will ask you to say, okay, we're going to look at a gatekeeper course. Let's say Algebra 101, often considered a weed out course, right, for students who are looking to go into STEM majors. We're going to look at Algebra 101 and the rates of students who receive A and B grades, C's, or D and F's over the last 10 years, and we're going to disaggregate by race. And we're going to look at, are there patterns in who is receiving higher reward for their study in this particular course, disaggregated by race. And that is useful to a degree, but it doesn't necessarily tell us, are there disaggregated results based on Black women and white men? And like, you have to go into the data so much deeper sometimes to get meaningful results. And so what does it mean to approach it this way? So the professional learning community approach within the equity scorecard is an institutional process of becoming aware of racial inequities, interpreting the meaning of those inequities, and then acting to address those concerns. It gathers stakeholders for sustained grapplings, usually over at least a semester, typically at least a full year, to grapple with disaggregated data, to develop theories of change development, and then to test some implementations, to pose hypotheses. I wonder if XYZ intervention would make a difference for the particular student group that we're interested in working with, and then putting into practice, and then assessing it and seeing if it worked, and then starting over again. So these are cyclical processes. They're very intentional spaces in terms of who's invited in. So for example, when I was working with the Equity Scorecard Pedagogy Network at Penn State, we were thinking about, oh, we need to bring in some of our STEM faculty because they are often gatekeeper courses. We need to bring in our director of institutional research. We need to bring in the leads of some of our multicultural resource centers. We need to bring in faculty advocates. We need to bring in student representatives. all of these voices that are going to be instrumental to thinking about the holistic experience of the particular student group that we're interested in. So it can't just be faculty talking to faculty, right? We do that all the time. It becomes just kind of like an echo chamber. But thinking really critically about whose voice needs to be part of this conversation. And that includes sometimes folks who are going to disagree, right? And who are going to push back about a lot of the things that you hold really dearly. So these can be difficult conversations if you are intentionally inclusive of who is going to be there fighting with you, but also who are the potential folks who are going to be fighting back, and how can you draw them into this collective process as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more later about who you might want to bring in to your circle and at what point. Are they there from day one, or do they come in when you start testing some of your interventions and your ways of moving forward? Yeah, I think I'll hold there for now if we want to go to the next bit too. So limitations. The equity scorecard, as I mentioned earlier, is an approach that was very intentionally designed to focus on racial equity gaps for domestic students. Data points that are typically used, again, as I mentioned, often begin with success in courses, AB grades, graduation, retention. Those types of metrics are often centered in equity scorecard approaches. These data points may or may not be relevant for international students, right? The academic challenges are not always the challenges to belonging that international students experience. And we noted that. So when we were doing the equity pedagogy network at Penn State, we often, quite frankly, removed international students from the data set because they were outliers. They were often the highest performing group within some of these STEM gatekeeper courses. And so we're like, well, that doesn't really help us because we're looking at the racial equity gaps between white students, Black students, and Latinx students, for example. And so international students in some ways became discardable in our equity conversations because they weren't part of the domestic narratives that we were working with in racial equity projects. But we know that's not true, right? We know that there are other barriers, there are other inequities happening for international student populations. But the way that the equity scorecard calls on us to disaggregate data either masks or renders invisible the challenges of international students. And so we have to think about data disaggregation. We have to ask about the types of data, where we're getting it in a different way in order to think about the experiences of international students. So it's not a one-to-one applying the equity scorecard to a new population. It's having to rethink some of the questions that the equity scorecard asks. We also have to grapple with a lack of disaggregated data. I'm thinking about many times when IPEDs or institutionally based data sets report out international students, it's reported as one big clump, right? All international students report XYZ, or this is how they're broken down. But we're in Northern Ohio, right? Up here, we're about half an hour from Canada. A white Canadian student who lives half an hour from here is an international student. But that's a very different lived experience than someone who moved halfway across the world, for whom English maybe is not their home language, who's having some cultural adjustments moving to this campus. And so what does it mean when we've aggregated, we've clumped together that white Canadian student who goes home every weekend with another group of students who have a very different experience? But oftentimes our data dashboards don't provide us with the mechanisms to be able to think more critically and more nuance about that population. And so we have to think about how to collect data differently for international students as well. I mean, Sayyora mentioned, a lot of people have mentioned, international student populations are incredibly diverse. Not just about the nationalities, the cultural home context, all of these things, but also we're thinking about how this intersects with race right now, with religion, with levels of political activity, with gender, with sexuality, with home language, a lot of different components. And that puts a lot of weight if you're trying to build one professional learning community that is tasked with addressing all of these questions for all of these populations. They may really struggle to come up with some proposed interventions that will be appropriate for the broader international student community. And so how do we think about maybe a PLC that is tasked with designing interventions in a lot of different directions for a lot of different folks? It's a complicated process. So where we're sitting with this mostly conceptual paper at this point, but at the end, we're going to talk about some of our early efforts towards putting this into practice, is how do you design a professional learning community model that will be appropriate and useful to address the multifold, nuanced, intersecting challenges that international students face, but also recognizing that this is an institutional responsibility, right? If these students have been recruited to our campuses and are telling us for decades that they are experiencing barriers to sense of belonging, to success, to true equitable experience on campus, then we can't not take very seriously our responsibility to address that problem. And we think that PLCs may be one strategy for moving that forward.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. So now that we have talked about why more intentional equity work is needed for international students and how traditional models fall short, I'd love to introduce the approach we are proposing. It is International Equity Scorecard Model. Yep. This model is actually inspired by Ben Simmons' original equity scorecard framework, which was all about identifying racial equity gaps through things like inquiry, reflection, and digging into disaggregated data. What we are doing is taking that same process and reimagining it with international students as the focus of the conversation. So our model is built around 4 key components, each designed to help institutions move from good intentions to real and meaningful change for international students. So the first is equity-minded professional learning communities. These are cross-functional teams made up of faculty, advisors, student affairs staff, and ideally people with lived international student experience. These communities are not just learning in the passive sense, they are designing for critical reflection and accountability and action. Next, disaggregated data use. This is absolutely essential. Most institutions report international student data as one broad category, usually non-resident aliens. That flattens the complexity of student experiences. Our model calls for region-specific, visa-specific, and where possible, intersectional data disaggregation. We can't address inequity that we don't name. Then equity-based dialogue. Instead of rushing to quick fixes, we encourage teams to slow down and ask tough questions, like, what are international students underrepresented? Whose voices are missing when decisions are made about the curriculum? Are the policies that unintentionally exclude? The process starts with curiosity, not assumptions. And finally, equity toolkit. To help guide these conversations, the model includes a set of culturally responsive tools. Things like classroom observation protocols, student interview guides, and policy review templates. These help ensure the work stays grounded in both data and real student experiences. Altogether, this model gives institutions a practical, thoughtful framework to start doing the deeper, more intentional equity work that international students truly need and deserve. So, how do we actually put this model into practice? Here is what we recommend. Be intentional about who is at the table. Don't just recruit faculty. Bring in advisors, student affairs professionals, and whenever possible, folks with lived experiences as international students. And offer real incentives. I think professional development credit, course release time, or other meaningful recognition. This work takes time and energy, and that should be acknowledged. The next is training facilitators well. They'll need a strong foundation in intercultural communication and racial literacy to guide these conversations thoughtfully and effectively. And finally, create safe, sustained spaces. These dialogues can get uncomfortable, and that's okay. What matters is that the space is supportive and that the conversations continue over time, not just as one-off workshop. What really sets this model apart is that it pushes back against the all too common tendency to treat international students as one homogeneous group with language barriers. Instead, it flips the script, asking institutions to take a hard look at their own norms and systems. That means reevaluating everything from syllabi and advising practices to classroom dynamics and campus policies. It also recognized that international students aren't just navigating academics. They are dealing with complex political and social realities too, from visa stress and immigration enforcement to global crisis back home. Those contexts really matter. And our model calls on institutions to actually factor those into the support systems they build. Now we invite you to the whiteboard activity. Let me stop to share this one. Ali is sharing a link, the whiteboard in the chat box. Please go ahead and click on it now. It takes you to whiteboard. Let me find it here. Share. Yay, people has already started. So we have two questions on the whiteboard. You can take a sticky note here, any color, choose any color, and please write down your answers on a sticky note and put it to the corresponding space. Not sure if you are able to get sticky note.
Having issues on my end. I'm not able to post. Oh, somebody did. Elizabeth worked magic.
Yay,
How did you do that?
yep, great. So you're gonna go to tools and appears sticky note there. So the first question is, what is the most significant equity issue facing international students on your campus?
I see a comment, make the sticky note bigger. They're all going to the same spot. Are folks having trouble being able to type in?
Oh, you can go ahead and make it bigger yourself. Everyone can do it.
Oh, Rachel's able to type. Good, making progress.
Yep.
Why don't, Sarah, if you're comfortable with it, why don't we pivot and have folks respond to that first question in the chat, just so that they're able to type? Because there seems to be
Right.
some text stuff.
Right.
So folks, if you wouldn't mind, we're going to pivot and say, what is the most significant equity issue facing international students on your campus? Into the chat would be great.
Okay. So I'll stop sharing here. Okay. Would you mind putting the question in the chat box? Or I can go ahead and try to do this.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? Because when we proposed this session,
Yeah, I put the question in the chat box.
yeah,
Then
when we proposed this session, it was before a lot of what's happening in the current moment, right? The visa revocations, the fears associated with deportations. Thank you, Anne. That's a great framing for it. And so we were thinking about different types of equity challenges, right? And so we're also trying to pivot in the moment. I'll say, for example, we had a school faculty meeting Wednesday here in the College of Counseling, Higher Ed, Leadership and Foundations at Bowling Green. And these questions started coming up about what is our responsibility as a school and as a college to be providing information to students who are deeply, deeply concerned and anxious about what it means to persist as an international student on our campus right now. What stakeholders did we need to gather if we were going to run an event that helps support students about that? Did we need to bring in our International Student Services Office? Did we need to bring in campus police? There are a lot of fraught conversations around that, but did we want to bring them in just for some, like, to say out loud, we will not comply with ICE if they come to us. We will not have that relationship. What would that look like? And then we found out about 5 hours after that meeting that the first Bowling Green student had had their visa revoked. So it was an unbelievably chilling immediacy of that response. And we're still trying to figure out what a professional learning community or a professional action community could look like in this moment for that concern, because it's very real and it's emergent. I'll put it that way.
I see great responses in the chat box.
Yeah. See financial inequity treated as cash flow. Often cash cow is the language that gets thrown around.
Okay. Are we ready to put the second question in the chat box?
Hold. I'm still seeing some new ones. Let's give it just one more
Right.
second. Unseen, dismissed, invisible.
Yeah.
Lack of trust in authorities to support their unique challenges. Covert discrimination. Finding marketable experiences. Absolutely. Thank you, Zella Rose. Okay.
Financial inequity is a big one as well.
Okay, so for those of you who listed a question, or those of you who didn't, if you were to try to build a professional learning community, you wanted to get a group of invested parties on your campus involved to talk about how do we solve this issue, who would you bring in, right? So who would you invite to participate in a PLC, or what stakeholders would it be important to include if you were to address that issue?
I put the second question in the chat box as well.
I will say, so while I completely agree that having international student presence in these learning communities is critically important, I also want us to push back against the sense that it is international students' responsibility to fix these problems, right? That the labor or the leadership in some of this work needs to be put on students themselves. It's this idea in equity mindedness and the scorecard in particular that says, no, we need to take institutional responsibility. Yes, absolutely, their perspectives, their narratives need to be in that space, but it is our job, right, to fix these barriers. So I encourage you to, while yes, center international students and their voices and experiences, also push beyond that and say, who gets paid to do this? Because the students don't in many cases. And if they're getting paid to do it, who needs to be in that room? Yeah, I'm seeing some leadership of different spaces, dean of students office, residential life. Absolutely. That's probably a professional learning community all of its own. How do we think about housing as being inequitable for international students? Institutional planning office, budget spaces, different colleges and universities. Absolutely. ISS, academic departments, vice chancellors. Human resources is an interesting partner to bring into these conversations as well. Faculty deans, fantastic. Financial aid, absolutely. I would also say your advancement office, private donors, right, can do different types of work than some of our financial, particularly for those of us at public institutions, that our financial aid office may not be able to do, but private donors could. I'm curious, would y'all bring up these folks in at the same time, or is this a staggered response? It's tough to answer as a big group, but think about it. Planting the seeds, staggered. Thanks, Ella Rose. Yeah. Working groups, absolutely. Do you have one PLC or do you have a network of PLCs that are happening all over campus? Yeah, too many cooks in the kitchen can also be a huge problem, absolutely. So the Equity Pedagogy Network at Penn State that I mentioned earlier uses a hub and spoke model, right? There was a central planning group, and then there was a dispersed group of professional learning communities all across. Penn State is a network of institutions, so they were at many campuses, but also many on each campus, working on very particular aspects of the equity issue we were looking to address. And then we held a summit every year where all those professional learning communities came back to the hub and talked about the work that they were doing in their particular space. So you may have staggered, you may have groups working in coordination, but around particular equity issues. And you may invite them in or out at different moments, depending on where you are in the equity process. Absolutely. I'm noting time. So let's pivot from this activity, finish the slides, and then open for our discussion if we could.
Yeah. We have already talked about the questions and answers. You have already. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and do our exit ticket, which is about the same questions I'll share. Could you please put the link?
It's in the chat.
Yep. Go ahead and click on the link in the chat box. It takes you to the previous questions. And we'll see if the answers would be different this time.
Folks felt pretty good about this with the first one too, which was awesome. So let's just do the next step slide, and then we can allow if folks have comments.
The other question?
Well, actually, I can just talk through it. So while we're working on the conceptual piece of this right now, one of the things that we're really excited about too is that we've received some funding from Bowling Green's Center for Faculty Excellence to run a pilot of our first PLC this coming fall. Unfortunately, it is going to be a one-off, which we talked about earlier, is not the way that you want to do this, right? As a one-off, 1-hour training. However, you take what you can get, right, in this moment. So we're starting it as a one-off sometime this fall, just to start gathering folks, interested stakeholders from across campus who want to be engaged in these questions. And then the goal, ideally, is to run a year-long professional learning community the year after, to really be able to dig in deeper. So we're excited about what's next. And also very excited with the time that remains to potentially have any comments, conversation, or dialogue with y'all about what do you think of the model? Do you think it's possible? How do we build it out that way as well? Oh, interesting. I see Leanne's comment in the chat. Who is running a professional learning community. Wonderful, focused on international and multilingual students, co-facilitated with Ann Smith. Offer a jointly designed workshop with the Office of Equity and Diversity about xenophobia. All right. Get it? This is Minnesota, I'm assuming. That's awesome.
Yeah, this is at the U of M, and we've run it twice. We've run the PLC now twice, although we've called it a faculty learning community, but it hasn't stopped a wide diversity of people. So you're giving me the thought that maybe we should change our name to a PLC, but we've had always people beyond faculty roles in the PLC, but we've had 28 people, so 2 cohorts of 14 with people from all over campus, and it's been really, yeah, we've kind of built around a textbook called Fostering International Student Success, which we can say more about, but it's been a really nice kind of like tangible, easy to read text that the faculty can read, and we build off of. I'm happy to share more, but yeah, thank you for everything.
I would love to hear more, because I do think there's like setting the curriculum for your PLC is always an interesting question. Is there a joint read? Because before you can, in equity scorecard approaches, before you can really start doing the hands work, you have to make sure that folks are have the same language, or at least a shared set of language to be able to do the work. And common reads like the text that you're describing can be incredibly useful starting places before you dig into the work of thinking about what the interventions are and of testing them and implementing them in there as well. So yes, absolutely. I'd be very curious to hear about how you've been structuring those, and may pester you through email later if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Please reach out. We'd love to share.
Thank you. Anybody else? Things that you'd want to share, push on, exciting stuff you've got going on your campuses? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz and Sayyora, and thank you, everyone. Now for the question Q&A session, feel free to put your questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself for questions too. Actually, here we actually have a question too, for our presenters. Oh, I saw Anne, you put up your hand. Yes, feel free to put your question.
I just had a question. I was just wondering, because we have been doing this for a little while at the U of M and just sort of in the beginning stages also. So doing a lot of learning ourselves, but did you say you have you're starting in the fall and a plan for a curriculum, or just, I'm curious to know where you are in the planning process of if you do have a book, or how you're thinking about kicking it off.
Yeah, so I would say I think y'all are likely further along than we are, is the sense that I'm getting here. Because we have only gotten the funding to be able to do a one-time 1-hour workshop kind of approach for this year, with the goal of building that forward to a year-long the year after. I suspect the 1 year will also be starting really with more of the equity scorecard literature and building it out of that, because we're trying to ground it in that literature. But I'm very curious about picking y'all's mind over at Minnesota about what have you been using as your curriculum? How have you been thinking about your common read? Does it need to shift now that we're in the post-inauguration generation and thinking about the questions that are facing us now that are different than the ones they were 2 months ago?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for your time today. Our session for today is coming to an end. Now I am going to share my screen again. Yeah, let's once again give a big applause to our presenter, Dr. Waltz and Sayyora today and our audience for giving us their time and commitment to this work. We would like to remind everyone that we are not done yet. So next week, next Friday, April the 18th, we will have our third colloquium session. Title is State of the CGDSD, Critical and Emergent Conversations on International Perspectives in the U.S. Higher Education. We hope that you will join us again. And before we leave, please scan the QR code here. And just a quick reminder, attending 3 out of the 4 sessions in our colloquium series, you will receive a certificate of completion. And you need to fill out this form for each session by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time by Wednesday, April the 30th. Yes. And once again, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was great.